I know who I am, and I don't try to be nobody else. And if that ain't good enough for you, too bad. But I can walk in any room knowing I'm going in as myself, and that'll have to do.
For 60 years, one piece of Dolly Parton never changed. The wigs got bigger and smaller. The rhinestones came and went. The nails, the heels, the waistline she joked about more than anyone ever dared to, all of it shifted with the decades. But the sleeves stayed. On stage, in interviews, at award shows in the middle of summer, Dolly Parton's arms were covered. It became so consistent that people stopped noticing it as a choice and started treating it as a mystery. Snake tattoos. A hidden scandal. Something she didn't want the world to see. She died on August 25, 2026, at 80 years old, after what her publicist, Marcel Pariseau, described as a brief battle with cancer. Her family said she passed peacefully in Nashville, surrounded by loved ones. And in the days since, millions of people who grew up loving her voice have gone looking for the answer to a much smaller question. Why did she never show her arms? The real answer was never a scandal. It was something far more human, and Dolly told it to the world herself, more than once, in her own words. This is that story, and the story of the woman who spent a lifetime deciding exactly what the world was allowed to see. To understand why Dolly Parton controlled her image so completely for 6 decades, you have to go back to a one-room cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee. She was born there in January 1946, the fourth of 12 children, to a father who farmed tobacco and a mother who somehow kept a household of 14 fed and clothed with almost nothing. Dolly told the story for decades of the doctor who delivered her being paid in cornmeal, because there was no cash in the house to give him. Poverty like that isn't a backdrop in her music, it's the whole engine of it. Her song Coat of Many Colors tells the true story of a coat her mother stitched together out of donated rag scraps, sewing in a Bible story about Joseph to make young Dolly feel like the coat was something precious instead of something pieced together out of leftovers. Dolly wore it to school proudly. The other kids laughed at her. She has called it, more than once, the favorite song she ever wrote, because it captured the exact moment she learned a lesson that would define her entire career. What looks like nothing can be turned into something beautiful if you're the one who gets to decide how it's presented. That lesson became her whole aesthetic. The teased hair, the acrylic nails, the tight rhinestone-covered dresses, the exaggerated hourglass figure. Dolly has said many times that as a little girl, she modeled her look on a woman in her hometown of Sevierville who other people dismissed as trashy. Dolly thought she was the most glamorous person she'd ever seen. She decided right then that when she grew up, that was exactly what she wanted to look like. Nobody handed Dolly Parton her image. She built it, on purpose, out of a childhood where she had almost nothing and was mocked for what little she did have. At 13, that same girl was already standing on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, introduced by Johnny Cash. By 18, she'd left the mountains for Nashville the day after graduating high school, with a suitcase and a plan. Once you understand where she started, the sleeves make a lot more sense. Because for Dolly, image was never vanity. It was armor she built herself, so no one else could ever again tell her what she was worth by looking at what she was wearing. Dolly's early career was built alongside country star Porter Wagoner, who gave her a regular spot on his television show in the late 1960s and helped launch her into national recognition. It wasn't an easy partnership. Wagoner was controlling, and Dolly spent years pushing to be taken seriously as a songwriter and performer in her own right rather than simply the girl singer on someone else's show. In 1974, she finally left the Porter Wagoner show to build a solo career, and she wrote him a farewell in the form of a song, I Will Always Love You. It was meant as a gentle, grateful goodbye to a mentor and a difficult professional relationship, not a love song in the romantic sense at all, though the world would eventually hear it that way when Whitney Houston's 1992 cover, recorded for The Bodyguard, turned it into one of the best-selling singles in history. Dolly, characteristically, turned the windfall from those royalties into something concrete. She used a portion of the money to help fund black-owned businesses in Nashville, including a stake in a local restaurant. The 1970s and 1980s turned her into a genuine crossover phenomenon. Jolene, released in 1973, became one of the most recorded songs in American music, a plea to a beautiful woman not to take her man, a song Dolly has said was inspired, at least in part, by a real red-headed bank teller who paid a little too much attention to Carl. 9 to 5, written for the 1980 film of the same name, gave her a #1 hit and an Academy Award nomination, and turned her into a movie star alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin in a comedy about workplace sexism that still feels sharp decades later. She went on to star in Steel Magnolias in 1989, playing a small-town beautician in an ensemble that became a defining piece of Southern cinema. Along the way, she recorded Islands in the Stream with Kenny Rogers, a chart-topping duet that became one of the defining country pop crossovers of the era. By the time of her death, she had won 11 Grammy Awards, sold more than 100 million records worldwide, and written an estimated 3,000 songs across a catalog that ranged from bluegrass to gospel to pop. She had done all of it while, by her own repeated account, maintaining ownership and creative control over her music and her name in an industry that rarely extended that kind of control to women. Dolly didn't just perform, she built. In 1986, she opened Dollywood in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, not far from where she grew up, turning a struggling regional theme park into one of the state's largest employers and tourist draws, drawing millions of visitors a year to a corner of Appalachia that had once defined her childhood poverty. She kept a controlling stake in her own publishing and recording catalog for most of her career, at a time when that kind of ownership was rare for any artist, let alone a woman in country music. By some estimates, her business holdings and songwriting catalog left her with a personal fortune in the hundreds of millions of dollars, money she was famously specific about redirecting. In 1995, she founded the Dollywood Foundation and, through it, the Imagination Library, a program that mails a free book every month to enroll children from birth until they start kindergarten. What began as a project for children in her home county in Tennessee grew, over 3 decades, into a global effort that had distributed well over 200 million books by the time of her death, reaching children across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Ireland. She often said the program came from watching her own father, who never learned to read, and wanting to make sure no child felt shut out of a book the way he had been. In 2020, in the early frightening months of the COVID-19 pandemic, she donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center for coronavirus research, a donation that helped fund early work that contributed to the Moderna vaccine. When the story broke, she brushed off the idea that it made her a hero, saying simply that she'd always felt that if she was blessed enough to have money, she should put it where it could actually do some good. Part of what made Dolly so hard to categorize, and so widely loved, was how deliberately she stayed out of the fights other public figures got dragged into. She was famously cagey about her own politics for most of her career, telling interviewers for decades that she'd rather write songs that everybody could sing along to than alienate half of her audience over an election. That reticence occasionally frustrated critics on both sides, but it also meant that by the time she reached her 80s, she was one of the vanishingly small number of American celebrities who could still headline an event and of almost nobody in the crowd thinking about how they voted. At the same time, she was unusually direct about who she welcomed. She spoke openly, more than once, about her love for and connection to the LGBTQ community, noting that gay bars and drag performers had helped build her earliest fanbase in ways she never forgot. She said she couldn't understand using religion to judge or condemn other people, since she'd been raised to believe faith was about love, not gatekeeping. It was a stance that put her, gently but firmly, ahead of a lot of her own industry for years. She carried that same instinct into her business. In 1986, when she opened Dollywood, she built it in Sevier County, one of the poorest parts of the state she'd grown up in, and made a point of hiring locally, at a time when the tourism industry in that stretch of the Smokies was thin. She renamed her old dinner theater attraction the Dixie Stampede to Dolly Parton Stampede in 2018, specifically to remove a word she felt didn't reflect the audience she wanted to welcome, a small decision, but a telling one, from a woman who rarely made a public move by accident. Ask almost anyone who worked with Dolly Parton what they remembered most, and the wig and the rhinestones come up eventually, but the joke usually comes up first. She built an entire public persona around getting to the punchline about herself before a reporter could get there first. Asked constantly about her figure, she'd say she was on a seafood diet. She saw food and she ate it. Asked about her wigs, she'd say her hair had been through more Nashville to somewhere flights than most touring bands. Asked again and again for 60 years, whether the blonde and the rhinestones were the real her, she gave a version of the same answer every time. It costs a lot of money to look this cheap. That humor did real work. It let her talk about surgery, weight, aging, and grief without ever handing a tabloid a headline she hadn't already written herself. When she and Reba McEntire spoke publicly about coping with loss in 2025, Dolly's advice was simple and unsentimental. Be grateful for the years you had with someone, take the best of what they gave you, and let it become part of who you are now. It was the same philosophy she'd applied to her own scars for decades, not erasing the hard thing, but deciding what to make of it. Against the backdrop of a woman who ran a theme park, funded a vaccine, and owned her own masters, the mystery of her long sleeves might seem like a small thing. But it followed her for decades, and the specific rumor that she was hiding sleeve tattoos didn't come from nowhere. It came from two other celebrities telling stories in public that were meant as compliments and instead became a decades-long guessing game. In 2011, on Craig Ferguson's late-night show, Roseanne Barr told a story that took on a life of its own. She said she probably shouldn't be telling it, then said it anyway, that Dolly Parton was, in her words, totally tattooed, covered in soft pastel designs with no black or blue lines, all bows and delicate imagery. 2 years later, British comedian Jennifer Saunders backed the story up with her own account. Describing tattoos she said Dolly had shown her privately during dinner. Angels, butterflies, baskets of flowers, described as small, artful, and nothing like a dramatic full-body piece. Saunders later repeated the story in her own memoir, saying Dolly had asked her, in the moment, to keep it quiet. Both stories were affectionate, not cruel. Neither woman was trying to embarrass Dolly. But once two people had said, on the record, that the tattoos were real, the public stopped asking why she covered her arms and started demanding to see what was underneath. Dolly didn't ignore the rumor. She addressed it directly more than once, over the better part of a decade, and each time, her answer got a little more specific. In 2014, on The Today Show, she was told point-blank that people believed her sleeves were hiding snake tattoos running down her arms. Her answer was 3 words. No, she didn't have those. 5 years later, in November 2019, she gave Robin Roberts on Good Morning America a much fuller explanation. She said she got tattoos to cover scars, that whenever she scarred from anything, the mark would take on a purple tint that never fully faded. Instead of living with visible discoloration, she said, she decided to decorate those spots with small flowers and butterflies. The medical term for what she was describing is keloid scarring, a condition where the body overproduces collagen while healing a wound, so instead of flattening out over time, the scar tissue can stay raised, thickened, and discolored, sometimes for years. It's more common in people with certain skin types, and it's notoriously difficult to treat. Dolly used that exact term herself in an interview with Vanity Fair, explaining that her fair skin made the purple discoloration especially visible, and that most of her tattoos started out as a way to cover a scar rather than as a fashion statement. In September 2020, speaking with People magazine, she went further still, tying it to a specific memory. She said that during a period when she was very sick, she'd had to use a feeding tube, and it left a small indentation on her side that she didn't like, because, again, her fair skin turned any scar a shade of purple that never really went away. Her solution was to have a small beehive tattooed over the spot, a little yellow and brown hive with a tiny bee on top, with the opening of the tube scar worked into the design as the mouth of the hive. She'd already said, in that same conversation, that her tattoos were tasteful, that she wasn't what she'd call a tattoo person, and that ribbons, bows, and butterflies were mostly what she had. When a reporter asked whether she'd ever had her husband's name tattooed anywhere on her body, she gave one of the lines she became known for. "No," she said, "he's tattooed on my heart." Put all of that together and the picture is straightforward, and it's one she drew herself, in public, across 5 years of interviews. She has keloid-prone skin. Scars leave a discoloration that doesn't fade. Rather than hide the marks under makeup or simply endure them, she chose to turn them into small, private pieces of art, and then she covered her arms, partly out of practicality and partly because the long-sleeve silhouette had already become part of her costume long before any of this ever came up. Photographs of her from the late 1960s, on the Porter Wagoner Show, already show her in covered sleeves, years before the scarring she described later in life. The sleeves were part of the character first. The medical reason gave them a second purpose later on. What makes this different from a typical celebrity mystery is that Dolly Parton was, by nearly every account, one of the least secretive people in American entertainment when it came to her appearance. She talked about plastic surgery before anyone asked her to. She had a standing joke that whenever something started sagging, dragging, or bagging, she got it nipped, tucked, or sucked. She once said it takes a lot of money to look this cheap, a joke that was really a strategy. If she said it first, no tabloid could use it as a weapon against her later. So the real question was never why Dolly was secretive. It was why she drew a line specifically at her arms, when she was so open about everything else. And the answer she gave, consistently, was that there's a difference between a choice and a wound. The surgeries she joked about openly were things she chose, for herself, on her own terms. The scars under her sleeves came from illness and medical procedures, moments when her body was in real trouble, not moments she was performing. She told Vanity Fair plainly that she didn't love making a big deal out of the tattoos, because people made a big deal out of every little thing regarding her. After 60 years of the public dissecting her hair, her body, her face, and her marriage, the sleeves were one of the only places left that stayed hers. There was one other thing Dolly protected with the same discipline: her husband. She met Carl Thomas Dean outside a laundromat in Nashville in 1964, the same day she arrived in the city at 18 years old. He was 21, running an asphalt paving business, and had no interest in the spotlight that was about to swallow her whole career. They married quietly 2 years later, in 1966, and then Carl did something almost unheard of for the spouse of a global star. He opted out completely. He skipped the award shows. He avoided interviews almost entirely, by most accounts giving only one in his life. Across nearly 6 decades of marriage, he was photographed only a small handful of times. Dolly has said he may have seen her perform live only once. That wasn't a marriage in crisis. By every account she gave, it was exactly the arrangement they both wanted, and she protected his privacy with total loyalty for 59 years. Carl Dean died on March 3, 2025, at 82. Dolly's statement afterward was short. She said words couldn't do justice to the love they'd shared for more than 60 years together, and thanked people for their prayers. A few days later she posted a second message, thanking fans for the cards and flowers sent in Carl's memory. The Grand Ole Opry marked its 100th anniversary just over 2 weeks after Carl's death, and Dolly, unable to attend, sent a video message saying her heart and her spirit were with everyone there. Reba McEntire closed the tribute by telling her, on camera, that the night simply wasn't the same without her. Months later, Dolly released a song written for Carl, If You Hadn't Been There, with lyrics asking plainly where she would be without him. It's impossible to tell this story honestly now without acknowledging what came after Carl's death, because Dolly said herself that the two things were connected. Through the back half of 2025, she pulled out of a Dollywood appearance and then postponed a planned Las Vegas residency at Caesars Palace, citing health issues that needed attention. As the concern spread online, her sister Frida Parton posted publicly asking fans to join her in prayer, a post that caused real alarm and had to be walked back. Dolly addressed the worry herself that October, telling fans plainly that she wasn't dying, that she wasn't ready to go, that she didn't think God was finished with her yet. She explained that after caring for Carl through his own long illness, she had let her own health slide, and was now working to catch up on it. Reba McEntire responded publicly with equal parts humor and affection, telling her fans that rumors of Dolly's death were, at that point, nonsense, and that she loved her with all her heart. In January 2026, Dolly missed her own 80th birthday celebration at the Grand Ole Opry, one of the only major milestones she'd ever missed in her career. By that spring, she'd canceled her Vegas dates entirely, describing ongoing treatment and a body that needed rebuilding, while, in the same breath, talking about a museum and hotel opening in Nashville and a Broadway musical based on her life that she was still actively writing and rehearsing. That was Dolly to the end, 80 years old, newly widowed, undergoing treatment, and still building something new. Dolly Parton died on August 25, 2026, at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, surrounded by loved ones, after what her team described as a brief battle with cancer. Her nephew, Brian Seaver, who had served as her head of security for more than 2 decades, recorded the video announcement she had asked him to make years earlier, before either of them expected to need it. He told her fans that sadness belonged to those left behind, not to Dolly herself, and that she had lived her life in the light. Tributes arrived within hours from across the entertainment world and across generations. Reba McEntire wrote that she would never forget their last conversation, and that there would never be another Dolly. Linda Ronstadt, her old friend and trio collaborator, called recording with her one of the most extraordinary musical experiences of her life. Paul McCartney shared a black-and-white photograph of himself meeting Dolly and Porter Wagoner at the Grand Ole Opry decades earlier and called her simply a wonderful woman. Kelly Clarkson posted that Dolly had a way of making everyone she met feel like they mattered. Musicians who had grown up on her records, alongside actors, politicians, and businesspeople she'd crossed paths with over 60 years, filled social media with their own memories of the woman who had, in one way or another, opened a door for them. Fans gathered at Dollywood itself, and the Great Smoky Mountains Lodge nearest the park credited her, in a public tribute of its own, with putting that whole stretch of Tennessee on the map for millions of visitors who might never have found it otherwise. Nashville's mayor said her impact was stitched permanently into the fabric of the city she'd called home since she was 18 years old. What struck so many people, reading through those tributes, was how consistent they all were. Almost nobody described the wigs, the surgery, or the rhinestones as the thing they'd remember. They described a woman who called them back, who showed up when someone was sick, who never let her own fame get between herself and somebody who needed her attention for 5 minutes. That consistency, more than any chart statistic, is probably the real measure of the 60 years she spent building a public self on purpose. The image was armor. The kindness underneath it, by every account of the people who actually knew her, was real. Even while she was undergoing treatment in the last year of her life, Dolly kept working, and it's worth pausing on what exactly she was working on, because it says as much about her as anything in her back catalog. She had spent years developing Dolly, a true original musical, a stage production built around her own life story, which had already had early workshop performances in Nashville before her death. She was, by her own description, still writing and reworking parts of it into 2026, treating her own biography the way she'd treated a scar, something to be shaped rather than simply displayed. Alongside the musical, she was preparing to open a museum and a hotel in Nashville later in the year, projects meant to give fans a permanent, physical place to encounter her story after she was no longer the one telling it in person. That instinct, to keep building institutions rather than simply making appearances, ran through the back half of her career. Dollywood itself had grown, by the 2020s, into one of the largest employers in East Tennessee, with an associated water park, resort hotels, and a dinner theater attraction that drew visitors from around the world to a corner of Appalachia that, within her own lifetime, had been defined mostly by the poverty she was born into.